Good morning, Redemption Church. It's great to see you all this morning. So this summer, every summer I take a couple of weeks off, and we usually go to New Orleans to visit Gabby's family. They have this beautiful condo that kind of overlooks the levee. It's got an amazing view of the bridge that goes through downtown New Orleans, the French Quarter, the Warehouse District. It's fantastic. Along that levee that goes along the Mississippi River, there's a running trail, and when we visit there, I often will go and run. Believe it or not. It's beautiful because it's like exactly a 5K from their house to the bridge and back, and so it works out perfectly. This summer I was running, and I got, 5 minutes into the run. I had Spotify's running playlist jamming, and it was pulling out some deep cuts. And I will be telling on myself a little bit here when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, and yet it profoundly rocked me. KB's We Will Win came on, and the two of you that know that song, KB is a Christian hip-hop artist, and he writes exclusively Christian hip-hop, decent hip-hop, that is. And there's a refrain that goes throughout the song, and it's the USA soccer chant, I believe that we will win, I believe that we will win, I believe that we will win. And so that's going on in the background, and then KB lyrically rhymes right on top of it. And he says, these are my inflections, not his. He does it way better than I do, but if I did it, it would probably be appropriation and not appropriate. I believe that we will win. Wait on it. Tomorrow we live. He's making all things new, making all things new. Tell the paraplegic that he will dance. Tell breast cancer that she won't win. Tell racism that he's going to end. What he doesn't heal now, know that he will then. And in that moment, with this sort of cheesy evangelical song hitting me, as the endorphins from the run, I'm sure, were also hitting me, I was overcome with grief. It felt like someone took a baseball bat to my gut. And I finally allowed myself to feel the things that I needed to feel that have accumulated over the last several years. And some of this is unique to me and my own personal life. The suffering that my family has endured with infertility and miscarriages and chronic illnesses, how much death has taken from us. How different our lives are required to be because of sickness. A sickness that has no answer, that has no healing, that is just, we hope, going to stay the same. God forbid, get worse. I also felt the grief that so many of us are carrying around with us, of a world that has literally gone to hell in a handbasket over the last several years, in ways that have probably always been true, but in ways that we have had to face and confront and watch on our screens as we've seen brutality of police violence, gross injustice and racism, a pandemic, divide in our country, in our families, in our friendships, in our churches. We've watched the faith that grew, the church that grew so many of us up, that introduced us to Jesus, that told us that Jesus loves everyone, turn around and hate and spew vitriol, toxic words to marginalized people. And like you, I've gone through all of the changes that our unique community has gone through over the last several years, and I was almost doubled over in the middle of this run with grief. But mixed into that grief, and perhaps what made the grief even more painful, even more like this yearning in my soul ache, even more was the reality that deep in my bones, I have a profound hope. That Jesus Christ really is actually making all things new. That in Jesus Christ, really and actually death will die. Not in some sort of like optimistic, meaningless way, but like really and actually death will be no more. And in the pain and in the hope, Jesus met me in a stupid little 5K run on a levee in New Orleans. And he reassured me, and it was painful to hear, but he reassured me, I am at work and I am making all things new. Keep going. One step at a time. Don't stop. I'm with you. My question for us this morning, there's plenty of grief to go around. There's plenty of reasons for you to be grumpy this morning. There's plenty of reasons for you to be cynical, to complain, to be wounded and jaded and just throw your hands up and say, you know what, forget about all of this. What makes us, Redemption Church, a community that has hope? What does that mean? That's what I want to talk about this morning. And as you can tell, this means a lot to me. Hope is something that has been a gift that God has given me that has brought me through some of the darkest things that I've had to confront as a human being. And what I want so badly is to like take some of the hope that God has given me and somehow plant it inside of your heart. I know I'm not able to do that in my humanity, but my prayer this morning for y'all has been that God would do that for me, for y'all, for all of us. We're going to talk about hope in kind of a weird way. Kara should thank me that I didn't make her read all of John 9. I would encourage you to read John 9 in its entirety, but it is 42 verses. And she would have been up here. She probably still would be up here reading if I had actually had her read this whole story. But it's a great story. John actually, when you think about how much time John spends telling this story, how much space he gives when in the first century, like space on text, like when you take pen to paper or quill to papyrus, like there's like a value to the actual work that John is doing here, the time he's committing to this. He's trying to say something. Being a community of hope means living with new sight. We're going to go about this in kind of an odd way this morning, I think. I would invite you to live with the blind man this week and his encounter with the living God. To come back to the story over and over and over again, if you would. But John's gospel is a weird one. It takes like a philosophical, theological, spiritual perspective. John is interested in the spiritual reality that kind of sits underneath or hides behind the physical world, the historical reality. And so he tells his story in such a way that he pays attention to the inner workings of our lives. He's actually trying to get into the nooks and crannies of your heart and speak directly to your inner self, to your soul. And so, yes, I do believe that Jesus actually encountered this blind man and healed him. Like historically, I believe that happened. But I think John tells that story in a way that's meant to cause something within us to encounter God. So for John, blindness is never just blindness. Sight is never just physical sight. And we get this by the end of the story. Jesus makes it plain when he gives us this cryptic little spin on things. Every detail in John's gospel is curated to try and draw something out of us. The blind man does not gain knowledge or insight or some new piece of data that changes his circumstances or his perspective. The reality shifting thing that happens to the blind man is that he's sitting there at the gate and Jesus passes by and says, well, he doesn't say anything. He spits on the guy, spits on some dirt and rubs it in his eyes. The blind man's like, hey, what the heck's going on? Now go wash it off. The blind man goes and washes it off, and then he comes back, and all of a sudden he's got his sight. And he has no idea what's just happened. Like, John does not allude to the blind man knowing who Jesus even was. He's not seeking Jesus out. He's not pursuing Jesus with all of his heart. He's sitting there begging, going about his business, trying to eke through another day of existence, and the God of the universe encounters him, shows up, changes his life forever. The blind man seems oblivious to Jesus, and yet Jesus comes to him. And it's this encounter that leads to the blind man's new vision. And everything about the man's world is changed in that moment. Think about this for a second. The vulnerability of blindness in general, but especially in the first century. How do you exist? How do you survive? What value and worth are you to your community, to your people, to the economy of Rome? Not only that, how vulnerable are you to being taken advantage of, to being abused, robbed, stolen from, lied to? The blindness of the blind man hints at some vulnerability here, some lack of control, some lack of power and influence that this man has. And when Jesus shows up, everything about his world is utterly changed. So much so that as the story goes on, and what we heard read, people don't recognize him anymore. Like, wait, who is that the guy? Is that the blind guy? I can't be. I don't know, it kind of looks like him. There's something about this person that has changed. And a new world of possibilities is opened up, right? So he is now got to figure out, wait, how do I start to live now? I used to beg because I was blind. I'm not blind anymore. I got a whole new world opened up to me. And when they confront him, his response is something along the lines of, hey, what did you do? How did you change? How can you see now? He's like, I don't know. I didn't change. I just met one who changed me. And this is the hope that we have. The hope that we have is not, hey, no, you need to follow these rules. You need to do this. Here's your checklist. And if you tick off these things, then your life will be radically different. The hope that we have is that we can, and many of us have, encountered the one who makes us see. Encountered the living God. Encountered Jesus Christ. And when Jesus Christ encounters us, we are changed. You might not feel it. You might not know it. You might resist it and fight it. But what God does in the person of Jesus Christ is he draws near to you and he says, see. And your eyes are opened and you're changed and you're transformed. And whether you like it or not, the world will never look the same. It's in this encounter with Jesus that we're made entirely different, not whole, not complete. The blind man, I assumed, died one day. I mean, he's not still running around the world somewhere. The blind man still had sins that needed forgiving. The blind man still needed redemption. But he was given something. He was given a glimpse, a foretaste of what was to come. He was given sight to see what God is up to in the world. Something that the religious leaders did not get. And he began to see the world and its systems and our place in it for what it is. And we see this as the story plays out. The blind man has a painful awareness of his previous standing and his new standing. And you and me, when we encounter the living Jesus, we are given hope. We're given hope that what is not what ought to be or what will always be. We are given hope that Jesus Christ really is at work making all things new, and he's not done yet. To quote my new friend KB. The hope born from encountering Jesus changes the way we see the world. And so we pick up in John 9. If you've got your Bibles with me, I want to invite you. We're going to go through this story quickly. We won't spend as much time in the text today as we have in some of the past, but it's helpful to sometimes read along. You can pull out your phones, go to a Bible app or Google. We're going to pick it up in chapter 9, verse 18. We're reading out of the New American Standard Bible, but whichever version that you will read that's helpful to you is a good one. Verse 18. The Jews then did not believe it about him that he was blind, that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. And they questioned them, saying, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?" Right, so there's been an encounter before this. The religious leaders have encountered the blind man. They're like, there's a little bit of a ruckus because this dude's going around saying, "Hey, I was blind and now I can see." They're like, bring him in. And they're like, "Hey, were you blind?" He's like, "Yeah." "Can you see?" He's like, "Yeah." "You're a liar." Right? This is kind of how the debate goes. So then they bring in his parents. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get someone to witness against him so that they can bear witness against Jesus, right? They're trying to trap Jesus here. And they're doing it through this poor guy who's just like, I was just sitting there begging. I don't know. Verse 21. But how he now sees, we do not know. Verse 20. His parents then answered and said, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." It's great parenting right there. I don't know. You got to testify on behalf of your son. I don't know. Sorry. Pleading the fifth. He's an adult. He can deal with it. Verse 22, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already reached the decision that if anyone confessed Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be excommunicated from the synagogue. That is not a minor detail. Anyone who begins to sniff around Jesus of Nazareth and make any sort of claim that hints that he might be the Messiah, that he might be the Christ, that he might be the one that we've all been looking for and longing for, if you even kind of suggest that, we are kicking you out. We are condemning you to what would amount in our language, we are condemning you to hell. You have no part in this community. You have no part in all the things that the community offers. You are an outsider. Get out. This is not a minor thing. Like, his parents are scared for good reason. And someone as vulnerable as a blind person who depends on the community for their very existence and survival, that is all at threat, at risk here. Verse 23. It was for this reason that his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." So for the second time, they summoned the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God." Which is funny because he is, right? There's all these things that John is doing here they're beautiful. It's very artistic. Well done, John. "We know that this man is a sinner." He then answered, "Whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." What I want us to see is that being a community of hope is costly. There is cost in hope. One, you run the risk of being wrong. You run the risk of looking ridiculous. You run the risk of looking like a fool. The hope born of Jesus will also cost us what N.T. Wright calls the myth of progress. See, the reality is that if Jesus really is the answer, if Jesus really is the one who's making all things new, then our pretensions, our power, our sense of self, our utter lack of need, or the things we do to try and pretend like we don't, our mask, our independence, our self-sufficiency, all of that is at risk. Jesus says, you're blind. And if you're not willing to go there, as we see at the end of this story, Jesus is going to say, I'm sorry, I've got nothing for you. Go back to your tribe. Sorry, that's a Survivor quote. Our pretension, our power, all the things that we do to try and build a good, happy lives for ourselves, how are we doing with that? Maybe you've got everything you've ever needed. Maybe you're happy as a clam. All I know from my own personal experience is that you can be happy as a clam, everything's going your way, and death will come knocking at your door one day. That is the hard reality of life, of being human. So much that we do in our lives is an attempt to mask that reality, to run from it, to pretend like it's not there. We are in grief over death, and we are living in denial to cope with that grief. You see, the Pharisees wanted their best life now. Right? The Pharisees bought into a system of certainty and surety that said, if I do this, then God will do this. If I follow these sorts of rules, then I can climb this kind of social ladder. It's all in my hands and within my power. I can build my own peace through making good, fiscally sound decisions. Oh, sorry, that's not what they said. If I can build my own peace through my own morality, my own effort, my title and my position. And the blind man is threatening everything about this framework, calling into question God's encounter of the least of these, the outsider, the one that they would have considered a sinner because he was blind in the first place. And in contrast, the blind man has no power. He's vulnerable. He's in darkness. He's not even seeking God that we're made aware of in the story. And he's given the gift of sight. Can you imagine how infuriating that would be if your entire life was built in such a way that you're trying to please God? And some like riffraff down the street, some beggar, some person that you look down on, punch down at all the time, all of a sudden God shows up and does something miraculous for them. Sorry, excuse me. Can you imagine how angry they must have been in this moment? How insecure they must have been in this moment? How threatened they must have been in this moment? This man was given the gift, not just of sight, but of a glimpse of the redemption that was to come to all the world. And the change in the blind man's reality is emblematic of the hope that we have. The world is in darkness. The world is in dire need of light. But it's not going to be given light because of our knowledge, because of our morality, because of our trying harder and doing better. Redemption Church, you as like individual, intelligent, powerful people are not the light of the world in that way. You are the light of the world because Christ is in you. Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann, in his work, The Prophetic Imagination, talks about hope in this way. He says, hope on the one hand is an absurdity too embarrassing to speak about, because it flies in the face of all of the claims that we have been told are facts. That hope flies in the face of reality itself. Hope is the refusal to accept that reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. And one does that only at great political and existential risk. Hope is costly. He goes on to say, on the other hand, hope is subversive because it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce to the present, to which we have all daring to announce that the present to which we have all made commitments is now being called into question. Hope is threatening. It's an absurdity flying in the face of reality, and it's subversive, limiting the present reality's claim, daring to announce that the present to which we've all made commitments is now called into question. The thing you're building your very life on is called into question. Look at verse 26. So they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open up your eyes?" And he answered them, "I told you already, and you didn't listen." This is one of my favorite stories in John's gospel, because the blind man in this moment, the power completely shifts, and he begins to teach them. And he has the truth, and they're now like the ones who are blind, and he's the one who can see. There's this whole thing that's going on here that's just perfect. And he answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciple too?" They spoke abusively to him and said, "You're his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he's from." Earlier in John's gospel, they said, "But we won't know where the Messiah is from, so he can't be the Messiah because he's from Nazareth." So the man answered and said to them, "Well, here's an amazing thing. You do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if someone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him." So there's this whole theology that the Pharisees have that comes from the Psalms that says only God can open the eyes of the blind. Right? So there's lots of things that maybe voodoo or witchcraft or something like that could possibly do, some sort of powers that are at work in the world that could fool us and trick us. But blindness was this unique, miraculous thing that God could heal that no one else could heal. And so there's some real theological stake in the claim that Jesus has made this man see. And so he's kind of going through their Messiah checklist. He's like, yeah, he's ticking all the boxes. Why are y'all not getting this? If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Verse 34, they answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and yet you are teaching us." But remember how this story starts. Was it his sin or someone else's that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus very clearly says, no, it wasn't because of sin at all. You were born in sin. So they put him out. And Jesus heard that they had put him out. And upon finding him, right, Jesus goes to him again, right? This is so beautiful. This is the heart of God, y'all. He said, "Do you believe the Son of Man?" And he answered by saying, "Who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" Has no clue who Jesus is. Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he's the one talking with you." He said, "I believe, Lord." And he worshiped him. What a moment this must have been. Verse 39, and Jesus said some really hard things. "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." And those who were with him from the Pharisees heard these things, and they said, "We're not blind, are we?" Jesus said, "If you were, then you would have no sin. But now that you maintain we see, your sin remains." So by the end of this story, the one who has the sin is actually the ones who are blind. And the blind man who had no sin is liberated. What I want to point out to us is that hope is costly, and that the hope born of Jesus will cost you all other hopes. It will infringe upon all their hopes. It infringes on what the Pharisees had all of their hopes in. They're putting all of their eggs in this basket, and Jesus is saying, no, that's the wrong basket. Once the blind man tastes this sort of hope, all of those other things that might have claimed to be hopeful for him, he's lost his taste for them. Throw me out of the synagogue, I don't care. Like I encountered this one who made me see. Like nothing compares to that. The reality is at some point, the hope that we have in Jesus is going to infringe on all the things that we're trying to build our lives on. The reality is also that this is going to happen one day, one way or the other. I think so much of what Jesus is trying to get at when he says, hey, look, if you want to come follow me, you must die to yourself, is he's trying to get us to the recognition that we are dying anyways. And you'll do a lot better to let go of all that junk that you think is actually giving you life and cling to me, the true giver of life. We will one day get to that place where the dreams we have for our lives don't pay us the huge dividends that we expected. That career we thought we were going to get that's just going to satisfy the deep recesses of our souls is disappointing. The justice that we were working for to see in the world, this is going to actually change some things. We get to a point and we realize maybe we've made a scratch, but oh my God, the injustice of this world is so relentlessly powerful. Maybe you poured all your hopes and dreams into a marriage that's failed. You thought maybe this one will love me. But it is here, in our loss, in our darkness, in our suffering. It is here in our blindness that hope is born. Because it's here in our blindness that God can finally go, now you're ready to see. Being a community of hope will mean seeing the world through the lens of resurrection. This is a hill I will absolutely die on. Pardon the pun, talking about resurrection. The salvation of you does not end until your broken and battered body is fully restored. I have lots of really obvious reasons for clinging to this hope. But anyone who has stood next to a casket and wept over the lifeless body of a loved one, have this hope that the one who spoke into nothingness and created something, that the one who overcame the powers of chaos and darkness, that the one who gave sight to the blind has entered into the recesses of death itself and has come back out the other side alive and has said, and now you will live too. Death will die in Jesus Christ. This is our hope. It's not that one day you're going to float off to some disembodied state in heaven. It's not that if you believe Jesus, everything will just kind of work out a little bit better for you in this life. That is not resurrection. That is not our hope. Our hope is that even when we die, we will not die, because Christ will rip us from the grave and make us alive again. And so hope will require us to acknowledge our state of woundedness, our need, our blindness. But when we're willing to do this, it will be painful. It's harder than numbing. It's harder than denying. It's harder than all sorts of unhealthy coping strategies. When we allow ourselves to look at the world and weep over its brokenness, we can begin to experience as human beings the reality that God is inviting us into, of opening ourselves up to and bearing witness to the reality that God is at work to heal the brokenness in our world and in our very selves. The famous theologian Jürgen Moltmann says this: our Christian life is lived in witness to the promises of a God who can and is making all things right. Our very lives are pointing to the reality that God will one day make all things new. And so being a community of hope means we are now free. What's left to fear? If death itself can't even conquer you, you're free to live into what God is doing. You're free to live into what is not yet seen in the face of what is seen. Hope calls us into that which is not yet, but what should be. We can fight for justice even in the face of insurmountable odds because of this reality. We can give our lives to our neighbor because of this reality. The Old Testament scholar Brueggemann goes on to tell us that as a community of hope, our task is to tell the truth to a world that's living in an illusion, grieve in a society that is steeped in denial, and hope in a world that has been given over to despair. It's not just something that we get for ourselves. It's something that can actually change the life of our neighbors. It's something that they desperately need. I want to wrap this up with a story. A friend of mine who actually just lives right down the street is I don't know what they even call them, a priest in the Episcopal Church, I think. But in one of her recent sermons, she shared the story that I was completely oblivious to. It's an amazing story. It's the story of Perpetua. Perpetua is the earliest and one of the only female voices, first-hand witnesses we have in the early church. She was a 22-year-old mother of an infant. She came from an affluent, influential family. And she was put to death in Carthage, in the northern province of Rome in Africa. Her, along with 5 others, were convicted of not worshiping the emperor. Right? And so the way this would have worked is you would have gone in and you would have bowed down to the emperor and given them some sort of like tithe or something like that, and they would give you like a certificate. And so legally, you would have to show like, hey, do you have this certificate? And so whoever was in charge in that province had found out there was this group of people that didn't. And so there were 5 of them. They were brand new converts, had not even been baptized yet. And she was their leader. Right? This brand new Christian, had everything to lose, is imprisoned for a while. Her well-to-do father comes to her and pleads with her, please give this nonsense up. Look, I've purchased you a fake certificate. Just give them this. She turns and looks at a pot lying on the ground and he goes, Father, what is that? He says, it's a pot. He says, and we can call it no other. I am a follower of Christ, and so I can only call myself a follower of Christ. This group of 5 individuals had such profound affection for one another that 4 of them were convicted to death, and the 5th said, no, I want to be with them. I don't want them to suffer alone, and entered into death along with them. The day of their death came, and Perpetua's father again pleaded with her, please, you're bringing shame upon me. Your child, think of your child. I can't bear to endure this. And she turns to him and she says this, it will all happen in the prisoner's dock as God wills. For you may be sure that we are not left to the power of ourselves, but are all in his power. She has a hope beyond her own power. She has a hope beyond the power of the influence and affluence that her family provided her. She had a hope beyond the power of the empire. She had a hope that was rooted in the resurrecting power of God. And so that day, Perpetua, along with the 5 others, entered into some form of a Colosseum. They were first mauled by animals. Some of them died, Perpetua didn't. Her and one of her dear friends, Felicity, who was actually a slave. So you had these dear friends, one a well-to-do, affluent new Christian, the other a slave new Christian who was 8 months pregnant. They were then put to death by gladiators in front of everyone to celebrate that Lord's birthday. But Perpetua had a novice gladiator assigned to her, and he stabbed her in the wrong spot and she didn't die. So she took the hand of that young gladiator and she pulled his sword up to her own throat. What kind of hope is that? What kind of faith? To enter into death, bearing witness that you can take everything from me, but you can't take anything from me. Y'all, I don't have that. Can I confess that to you? I'm taking the cheap certificate. I'm bowing down. I'm probably doing all the things. But Perpetua stands as a prophetic voice, a 22-year-old female who has a lot to teach me and a lot to teach you about hope. In an age of comfort and affluence, in an age that tells us our hope in Christ is really just about giving us our best life now, Perpetua stands as a prophetic voice that says, no, there's a far deeper hope here. She shows us what hope looks like. She shows us who Jesus is transforming us into. I want to wrap this up by reading the words of John from another book. These are words that were encouraged by Zach, one of our founding pastors, that he used to read at funerals. And I've since found it incredibly important and insightful to this be the last thing that's said at any funeral I do. And unfortunately, I've had to do a lot of them. The words of John in the book of Revelation, in the book of John, pieced together, say this: let these words of Christ sit with you this morning. Fear not. I am the first and the last and the living one. I became dead, and look, I'm alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and of Hades. Because I live, you also will live. Let it be, Lord.